All right, welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we are going to be talking about topic 2.2, the Mongol Empire and the Modern World. We're in Unit 2, which means we are focused on the years between about 1200 to 1450 CE. All right, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so learning objectives, things we are trying to fulfill here for our AP learning objectives. So we want to be able to help produce a little bit into being able to perform these objectives, right? These are the things you need to be able to do as according to the curriculum. So you need to be able to explain the process of state building and decline in Eurasia over time, explain how the expansion of empires influenced trade and communication over time. So Mongol Empire is going to fit into that, of course. And then objective 2D, explain the significance of the Mongol Empire and large patterns on continuity and change. And that's, of course, one of the maybe the most specific of the ones that we get to in this topic, where the other two you can put in other units and other topics, I guess, into that. So really focus on 2D here. Okay. All right, so let's get started here. So the Mongol story goes deep, of course, but we're going to really start here with about the 1100s. So in the 12th century, as that would be, the Mongols were one of many different tribes in kind of the northern steppe of Central Asia. Okay, a lot of different tribes there. These people live as pastoral nomads, meaning they move around with animals. That's basically their livelihood. Okay. Now, north of, specifically with the Mongol tribe, or Mongol tribes, as there were kind of a few, these sort of different clans. They were north of what is the Gobi Desert today in East Asia, so it'd be around kind of north of what would be China today. And these people, their whole lives were living in it was a very harsh life, right? In a very arid Asian steppe. This area does not prove itself well for agriculture, as there aren't as many or as much of the favorable climates or as productive river valleys. But it does make grazing basically a possible and can be a very successful livelihood. But it doesn't support itself to large-scale cities generally. So these people, again, live more as pastoral nomads. Now, as part of the required basically feature of being a Mongol was being able to be a skilled horse rider. That was kind of everything. These people are the quickest and among the best, maybe the best horse riders in the basically the whole world. And what is the constant among Mongol history is hunting and warfare. Hunting, you have to be a skilled rider so you can be able to hunt. If you don't hunt, you're not eating, you're not surviving in this territory. And then warfare is also common amongst pastoral grounds and the tensions that can come between competing tribes. So these are kind of the valued, courageous traits that were appreciated among the Mongols. Now, some of the other non-Mongol tribes that were around them were the Tatars, the Naimans, Merkits, and the Jurchen. So these were other tribes that they had interaction with, positive and negative. And one thing that is kind of a part of these people too was their proximity to the Silk Road. And the Silk Road, had been going on for many, many centuries, and they kind of coveted the wealth and of the tribes and the kingdoms that were populating the Silk Road. So they had constant interaction with it, and definitely would be a motivating factor for the Mongols trying to move into these areas, as they provide an immense amount of wealth. Because that's one thing that pastoral nomads can do is trade. Usually, they kind of have to trade. They can trade, some of their commodities, which would be like animals, right? So horses and other domesticated animals, they could trade those to agricultural societies for food. Like, for example, the Mongols would trade, or these tribes just in general, would trade like livestock for agricultural surpluses, like rice or something like that would be coming out of somewhere like China, for example, and other places as well. So where we're starting with the Mongol tribes, when eventually start unifying, and we're going to talk about that process here. Of course, we're going to be talking about Genghis Khan, very famous character in history. So once the actual Mongol tribes were sort of united, you have a territory looking somewhere like where this. You can say this is modern day Mongolia, part of what would be southern Russia, and parts of China. This is kind of the origins. Now keep this in your mind here, because what of course is going to happen very, very quickly is how large this Mongol-controlled area is going to be. It's going to be unlike anything we've really ever seen before with territorial expansion. So keep that in mind, because we are going to revisit this image, but see as it grows. All right, well, when you're really talking about the Mongols, yes, you can talk about some of the early Mongol years, but mostly we get it talking really with Genghis Khan. So Genghis Khan was born Temujin in the year 1162 of one of the Mongol tribes. Now there is a long, history, of course, of his upbringing and things like that. We don't have time to talk about that. I would suggest possibly checking out the extra history series that they did on Genghis. You'll get more than you would ever really ask for when it comes to his life, and it does explain a lot about some of his characteristics and some of his trait, which when you learn about a pretty brutal and tumultuous upbringing that he had, that again explains a little bit about where his motivations come from. But yeah, I would definitely check out the extra history. Extra history is the channel, their little series on Genghis Khan. There's about 6 parts, or about 10 minutes each. Really entertaining, so definitely check that out. So one of his goals was to create an alliance among the other sort of Mongol tribes, and there's a lot of ways he did this. One way, for example, he did this was marrying off his older son to the daughter of another sort of Mongol king. By the way, we're going to use the term a Khan. A Khan is a king. It's basically the term that the Mongols use for their leader. And one of the things that set apart Genghis from not only a lot of these other tribes, but many of the political organizations around the world, was one of meritocracy, meaning the positions of power under him were appointed to people of talent and not just from their family. Okay. And again, this was very uncommon, because usually people, when it came to trust, would trust their family members. But he appointed powerful positions, based on talented. And even in a lot of cases, a lot of these people that he appointed were not relatives to him, but they were put in positions that ruled over his family members. So he was more concerned about the talent of the people rather than even being his own kind of family. And again, he saw this because he saw personal loyalty really as the best, most successful way to run a kingdom. And come to fast forward kind of the story a little bit here, that definitely showed in kind of their conquests and some of their organization, which was having very, very skilled leaders. And I think that definitely helped. Okay, he was, of course, known for his ruthlessness, which we can talk about a little bit. The brutality on a really epic scale of Genghis Khan cannot be ignored, which we'll talk about more later as well. But anyway, he eventually was elected the Khan of all the Mongols, the Khan of Khans, as it was called, at what is called a Kurultai. A Kurultai is this meeting of the powerful people of the powerful Mongols. And they would get together and have elections on who would be the Khan, who would be the leader of all the Mongol tribes. And he was elected that. It was at that time, too, where he took the name Chinggis Khan, which basically translates to ruler of all. I've heard this be like universal ruler. About the biggest name you could possibly have that could encompass the most amount of things that you could rule. Really, the word Chinggis Khan really envelops that. So, perfect name for a guy that has, I guess, these sights set on a global empire. Okay, so let's talk about the beginning of kind of the conquests. So first thing they did was attacked eastward toward what was known as the Jin Empire, and this is in 1210. So the Jin Empire, just a little bit about them. They were established in Manchuria, which is kind of part of northern China, Inner Mongolia, and northern China. Their capital was Zhengdu, which is actually present-day Beijing. And you get to see a little bit about his sort of style of conquest too. Because what would often happen with Genghis was he would sort of offer some kind of deal before an attack sometimes. He actually oftentimes wanted to be more diplomatic about things. But there was always a deal that favored the Mongols about this. Like, we'll save you, but you're going to have to, obey us and do these things for us. And we'll talk more about that later, too. But as part of kind of his brutality, he was known for basically, if someone again had not surrendered and they put up especially a good fight, what the Mongols would often do is kill the entire civilian populations of town, basically leave nothing left. Right, the entire civilians, not just the armies, sometimes not just the aristocrats. We're talking the entire populations would be completely slaughtered. And as these early conquests were happening, and the news of this brutality just spread like crazy. What this ended up doing is oftentimes the news again of their brutality would precede the places that they would invade, and because of that, sometimes the enemies would already decide to surrender before they basically even have to give word. So this brutality, did lead to actually having to them to avoid some conflicts there. So you get that going in kind of northeastern China. Now, Genghis will not actually conquer the entirety of China. That took many years, even after he had passed on. But you do start to see that process. Okay, then you start seeing more south and southwest conquests. So he conquered what was called, it's in Central Asia, called the Karakai Empire, and the Islamic Khwarezm Empire. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing things, in 1219. So you can see this conquest is now spreading, and again, these things are happening very quickly. Where he's attacking east, and then within the same decade, has already conquered complete empires in the south and southwest of Asia, or sorry, the central and south central sort of and southwest parts of Asia there. So what ends up happening is kind of by as he's getting older, he has established a Khanate, or a kingdom. That's what they call what they rule, a Khanate, and a Khan rules a Khanate. And that spread basically from the North China Sea all the way to the eastern borders of Persia by 1227, which territorially marks it easily among the most conquered territory anybody has ever done in their lifetime. Okay. Now, a little bit about the Mongols in warfare. So, as a people that grew up as nomads on the steppe, they are experts at mobile warfare, specifically on horses. There's really nobody better in the world at horseback riding. Now, because of their hunting and war-like culture, their real great weapon that combined with their horseback riding was a bow. They used a sort of compact, shorter bow. More like a composite bow, if you know a little bit about that, which was great because it was mobile. And as you can see from the picture, kind of down there, it has this curved. It's a curved bow and then recurved, and the materials to be able to keep it from that tension it's an incredible skill to be able to build these things. But nevertheless, what made this so good is it was small and about as high velocity probably as any bow in the world. So they were incredibly mobile and were able to attack with such speed and ferocity. Their army was extremely disciplined, and part of that might be from the fact that, again, he promoted people that were loyal and talented to him and to the whole chain of command. And they had a command structure which was incredibly detailed about you have this leader, and then they have a certain group of people, and the orders are very, very crisp and clean with how they're actually given out. They did a lot of their homework, and just went to extensive levels of trying to get detail. They had messengers that were famous for riding for days and days without stopping. It's said that these Mongol messengers, for example, could sleep while on horseback while their horses continue to go. So it's non-stop there. Messengers and scouts they would send out to map out terrain, and they can do it basically secretly because they're so quick, right? And they don't make a big impression that way. So this communication and information gathering was just kind of top notch for the time in this world and this time period, because they're all about using geography, and they can fight in about any geography at this time, especially or in this region. Okay, a few other things. They were known for using some surprise tactics. One of their famous ones they would do was they would get a small sort of band of warriors on horseback and pretend like they're like attacking. And they would make sure, of course, that this band of warriors was much smaller than the army they were going to face. Now, since they were fast, this was able to work. So what they would do is they'd go and attack and then act like they're like, oh crap, we're outnumbered, so we got to retreat. So they would retreat and basically bait the enemy into following them. And when what they would do is those warriors would then retreat back to the rest of the army, where they have a much larger force, and then they would attack that way. So basically baiting them to come out of their defenses. And yeah, this fake retreat was a very valuable tactic for them. Okay. Now, like I've said before, one of the things they would often do was Chinggis and just would send out these sort of small little envoys, right? And basically seek a surrender of the enemies, basically saying, we'll spare you, but you're going to pay tribute to us. You're going to be under our rule, but for the most part, you know, you're going to be able to keep kind of what you do. And we'll talk more about the Mongols as actual rulers later here, but basically they would put out this option for surrender. Now, the problem, I guess, in a way, was that if the enemy refused, you know, the surrender terms that the Mongols provided, then you saw the legendary brutality of the Mongols and Chinggis Khan. They would kill, especially, they would go after aristocrats, and I'll tell you why aristocrats, meaning the rich owner, land-owning kind of nobles, a lot of their crafts workers, miners, and a lot of their other skilled workers, and leave a lot of the peasants and that sort of thing. And one of the reasons that they may have done that was, you know, they would wipe out these people. They would use a lot of these people as laborers, but also to win people over, because these peasant types were loyal to these aristocrats, right? And a lot of these, maybe they were stubborn and again didn't want to lose their standing by surrendering to the Mongols. So basically, who they would have been loyal to is no longer gone, which thus may have made it easier for these people to then be loyal to the Mongols, these surviving people, as the people that they were bound to and loyal to. They really no longer exist. One group that they would often spare were literate. Okay, the literate educated. And they would use them, they would recruit them, and often they would join their army, or they would send them back to the cities so they could learn more and use these educated people. And we'll talk more about how they were used eventually too, because some of them are actually used against their own people to develop weapons and things like that. And we'll talk about that a little later too. Okay, the Mongols were definitely ones that were always incorporating and interested in new technology. So when they would attack people, and again, why they would keep sometimes some of these more literate people and keep people around, some people around in general, again, it was very targeted. They would, you know, slaughter a lot of people, but was to basically incorporate the technologies of their enemies and their weapons and use them. So, for example, Mongol siege weapons. Okay, the Mongols, of course, were most successful in open battle, right? Open field battle. You mean you really couldn't stop them. Where the Mongols, of course, had been slowed down was with walled cities, because that requires a completely different style of warfare. And walled cities had basically been impenetrable for, you know, the existence of walled cities in history. So, some of these engineers of the Chinese and the Persians that they had conquered, they basically brought them into their military and used them, those engineers, to build siege weapons that ended up being used against their own people. So it's like you defeat this Chinese group and you use their engineers to defeat other Chinese groups. So some of those things were like portable towers and catapults, as you can see from the artwork down here. So they were always innovating these kind of new ways to always adapt to the battles in front of them, right? And defeating those walled cities was such a difficult task. So that's just a couple of examples there. Okay, another thing they did too was to be able to spread message over the long periods was basically create a postal system in a way, Pony Express. Although you wouldn't have find as really all that many written messages being traveled here, they would carry oral messages, again, for long periods of time, to send out word for maybe reinforcements or whatever. Okay, so again, to kind of sum up kind of the policy, you would say here. In a lot of these cases, the Mongol brutality was usually scaled to how much of a defense the enemy gave. The harder the enemy often fought, or the harsher their rejection of their surrender, usually the more brutal the Mongols were. Right? They usually scaled it that way. One reason why it was incredibly brutal with the Chinese and stuff like that is because they fought back so hard. However, when a conquest was over, or you have been sort of added to the Mongol Empire and you're under Mongol rule, there it is a kind of a polar relationship. You have this brutality that they were known for, but as compared to a lot of governments and empires sort of in world history, the Mongols were incredibly tolerant of a lot of things. And I'll show you what I mean here in just a second. So for this next around 100 to 200 years or so, there's a time period that historians call the Pax Mongolica. If that term kind of sounds familiar, you might be thinking of the Pax Romana, which stood for the Roman peace, and this is the same thing. And historians have kind of attributed that to this time, because during this time, within the Mongol Empire, it was very peaceful and prosperous. But of course, on the outside, the brutality was catastrophic. But yeah, you had this going on. Now, the Mongols by nature are a nomadic people. However, they did start to sort of develop administrative centers. For example, the Mongol capital at what's called Karakorum was one of the first real Mongol capitals, and that's actually in modern-day central Mongolia. And here, for example, Chinese and Islamic scholars and engineers were basically moved to this city so they could be of use there for their studies. It's possible that under Chinggis Khan, under the Pax Mongolica, they built more infrastructure almost than anybody. For example, he is known for maybe having built more bridges than any ruler in history, which is again interesting when you think about the great infrastructure empires of the world like the Persians or the Romans. But comparatively so, his policies were far more liberal than any of the day. One of the most famous policies that they had was their religious tolerance. You know, this empire, they very much knew that this empire was very diverse in their different religions, so religious tolerance was granted, and in fact, a lot of people from different religions were put in, these Mongol courts, and actually, a lot of them, some of these Mongol Khans took a lot of pride in saying, in my court, I have Christians, and I have Muslims, and I have Buddhists, and have all this, and kind of use that maybe as a way to to gain more knowledge about their empire. So there's a question, though, that I think needs to be asked too, which is, did the Mongols try to push their religion on people? No, and there's kind of a reason for that. The Mongol religion is tied to basically the Mongols, and specifically, it's actually tied to their land. It's one and the same. Their religion is tied to their land. So you basically need to be a Mongol in their origins of their land, really for their religion to even apply. So there was no real need or really even possibility for any kind of proselytization. So that might explain that question, which I've also often heard come up from students of mine or just other people. Okay. One of the goals, for this Mongol conquest by Genghis Khan was to control the Silk Road. Genghis Khan very much was economically minded. He understood the value of controlling the Silk Roads and being able, especially, to control the crossroads of the Silk Roads that connect again East Asia with the Middle East, with Europe, and eventually leading to places like Africa, was of great economic value. So he went to very, very serious lengths to make sure that the Silk Roads were protected and traders were protected. Laws were incredibly harsh for people that broke laws, trade laws, or attacked traders, or made it unsafe or anything. Very harsh, swift punishments for that. Which we also say, this kind of safety that the Mongols have garnered here, created what's called the Third Silk Road Golden Age. right? So there's these different eras sort of the most successful years of the Gold Age, and the Mongols are responsible for bringing in that new one, and not only just protecting but also expanding new trade channels, so different routes that connected again Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Europe. And if you were one of the fortunate survivors of Mongol conquest, you got to benefit from this, and this made a lot of merchants a lot of money, and connected all basically of the supreme technologies of Eurasia were able to make their way across the Silk Roads. We'll talk more about some of those specifics, things that were happening there too. Another attempt trying to do was to adapt writing systems. For example, they captured a scribe whose job was to basically adapt the Uyghur alphabet to represent Mongol and try to create some unification with literacy that way. However, they did fail though to establish like one unified imperial alphabet that the whole empire would use. But nevertheless, this alphabet and the changes that were made are actually still used today in Mongolia. So you did see some academic kind of pursuits that Chinggis Khan was doing. Again, that's why he would often spare a lot of these intellectual and educated people, was to use them for other types of benefits for the empire. Okay, well, eventually Chinggis, of course, will pass away. Chinggis also is legendary for the amount of children that they had. He had many. The Mongols were very notorious for having a lot of these basically like rapes, of a lot of these people, and a lot of wives and a lot of concubines. So his progeny is legendary with how many ancestors he has. It's really incredible that. But so he has a lot of kids, of course, and specifically it's his grandsons that really set up and really continued on with ruling the empire after he dies. And there's these different Mongol Khanates, so we're going to talk about them, but they were basically each sort of ruled by one of his grandsons, and they each kind of took it upon themselves to expand the empire in other further directions. So we're going to mostly spend time about three of the major ones here. Okay, so his oldest son there was Batu. So Batu, he is going to be in charge basically of what today would be Russia and the conquests. He took 100,000 troops, which is an incredible amount of fierce mobile warriors, and invaded Russia or what's today at least, Russia in 1236. This army, and actually this whole Khanate, will be known as the Khanate of the Golden Horde. That's what they're going to be known for now. And basically what they ended up doing was these Russian city-states and communities could not defeat them. So what ends up being creation is a tribute system. So pretty much it's like a threatening, almost mafia-like thing where the Golden Horde would come in, conquer, and basically say, hey, you're going to pay tribute to us, or otherwise we're going to continue to, ravage your land and ravage your peoples that way. They were requiring them to pay tribute, and these were paid for basically centuries, a couple centuries. We'll talk about when this ends a little bit later. One of the key moments too was sort of the capital city of Kiev was looted and basically destroyed in 1240. So really the administrative and economic center was, again, not just under a tribute of them and pressured into some kind of deal, but actually looted and destroyed the extremely important, powerful city of Kiev. So what we end up talking about here, the Empire of the Golden Horde, if you can kind of get a geographic understanding here, ends up being in basically this territory right here in the purple, where the other Russian principalities, so this is the actual direct Empire of the Golden Horde, where these Russian principalities were put under Mongol tribute system. So the Mongols basically indirectly ruled these green areas here in Moscow, Kiev. I just told you how in Kiev they destroyed, just leveled the place. But this is, again, what we're talking about. So this is now called the Empire of the Golden Horde. Okay. Now, early on, the Mongols here practice, kind of continuing on with some of Chinggis's policies here. Especially initially on, there was religious tolerance and promotion of a lot of trade to connect this region with the others. Some of that ended up being not really continuing. especially when they started moving into like Western Europe and conquering a lot of these Christian lands, where the relationship between the Christian and Muslims was not very good at all. In fact, the Pope sent basically a these messages like, hey, you should convert and all this. And basically the Mongols said, we're not going to convert. And how about if, you keep this up, we'll just come destroy you, that kind of thing. So a lot of pressure and a lot of hostility between the groups there. So they continued on and, again, fought different conquests against different groups. And a lot of these groups, attempted to make alliances because really you have to defeat an army of this 100,000 man skilled army here. So there was, for example, a unification under a king called King Henry of Silesia in 1241, where basically under his leadership they created an alliance of Polish, German, and French knights. Remember, this is kind of the medieval knight time. Knights, Knights, but and they were defeated. So they did that, and then eventually defeated kind of the rest of these major groups with the Hungarians in Eastern Europe as well. Okay, well, the rule of the Golden Horde changed when Chinggis Khan's successor, the great Khan of this time, Ogadai Khan, he died. And what Batu ended up doing was he called off and stopped the attacks that, as the Mongols again were continuing to push deeper and deeper into Europe. And he actually called off this attack so he could go home, return back home to their homeland, and go to the funeral, of Ogadai, because they're all related here. And to discuss basically the issues of what is going to happen now. So this ended up occupying a lot of his time. And the interesting kind of thing was afterwards, it seems that Batu lost some of his interest in conquering Western Europe. I don't know if this was just because he was becoming distracted with these other things and had other motives, but this ended up basically stopping the conquest in the West at this time. Like I said before, the Mongols ruled basically here in northern and western Russia here through tributes of existing rulers. Basically, they said, hey, you keep paying tribute or we're going to destroy you. That's basically what it was. And the Mongols liked the system too, not just because it was easier, I guess, in a way to manage this territory, but the Mongols really did not want to live in Russia or really in Eastern Europe. They didn't want to live in forests and that kind of stuff and really change a lot of their way of life. So specifically this group really liked that because they didn't really want to move there. Okay. Just to kind of talk about sort of the end and the final years here of the Golden Horde. So rulers of Moscow, especially, were collecting a lot of these tributes. So what they would basically do is they would collect these tributes from the other regions around Moscow and Russia here, right? That's kind of where the pay source came through. But what they were actually doing over time is, each year, whenever that these tributes come in, they would kind of secretly set aside some of these funds into another account or something, if you will, and was using it to finance and grow an army to eventually resist the Mongols. So one of the big moments of this resistance was when the a big Russian coalition actually defeated the Golden Horde in battle in 1380 at the Battle of Kulikovo. And really from this point on, the Mongol influence will start to decline. But it's going to take a long time before the full Mongol interaction, right, and sort of rule over Russia will end. I mean, it actually is by the mid-18th century. So basically, it went to the 13th, the 1300s, the 1400s, and the 1500s, as they were slowly chipping away. And by the mid-16th century, they defeated basically the remaining Khan's descendants there, except for one group called the Crimean Tatars. They were still around, and they actually did not get defeated until the late 18th century. We're talking late 1700s here. So this Mongol relationship lasted, and rule over Russia lasted centuries. Okay. But overall, the Mongols had a very much a long-lasting impact on Russia, even if it was just a tributary relationship with a lot of this. An incredible amount of Russians were devastated through death and destruction of their land through Mongol attacks. However, they did eventually recover after they defeat the Golden Horde. Okay. One thing this ended up doing too for the sort of the Russian royalty, the Russian princes, was they learned a lot about military organization over these many decades and stuff of fighting the Mongols, and end up being far more organized and successful as a military because of their interactions and what they had learned against fighting from the Mongols here. So, with the Mongols basically ruling the Russians for 3 centuries, what this ended up doing too was because of that, Russia's ties to Western Europe were severely crippled, and Russia did not interact much with Western Europe, which means a lot of the Western culture and developments didn't really go to Russia, and people, especially in Europe, Western, Central Europe, etc., especially Western Europe, started to see the Russians not really as like fellow really Europeans anymore of that cultural tradition, saw them as kind of something different. And because of that too, Russia developed a much more distinct culture than what was going on in Western Europe. Okay, it isn't until some of the efforts of later, sort of the later Russian rulers like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, where you start to see the Russians try to integrate more with Western culture. But the Mongol resistance, and I guess in a way, sort of almost like the nationalism that was kind of created as the Mongols were a common enemy, definitely created the foundation basically for the modern Russia today that will be there. And this unification, again, having this common enemy was a big part of that. All right, let's go ahead and move on to one of the other Khanates that has been created here. This one's, as you're going to see in a minute, is called the Ilkhanate. So here's what you got. Another one of Chinggis' grandsons is in charge, and his name is Hulegu. And he led the Mongols into the Abbasid Empire. So if you've been following with the other lessons, the Abbasids are an Islamic group that rules essentially what is Persia. So they led a massive army into the territories in 1258. And one of the key features of this was the Abbasids not unwilling to accept any surrender or any kind of deal with them. And basically what Hulegu and these what he had done was when he would send these envoys to offer some kind of surrender or something like that, basically said, hey, if they don't do this, if they don't accept this, then destroy them. Even the city of Baghdad, which for much of history of the Abbasids was their capital. Once they conquered the Umayyads, they kind of moved their administrative capitals to Damascus, I believe. But Baghdad was basically the most intellectual center, to be honest, of the world. Was an incredibly highly populated, one of the most metropolitan, successful, populated cities on the planet. And the caliph there and the rulers there, they rejected the sort of Mongol offering there, and in response, absolutely destroyed the city of Baghdad. It is the siege of Baghdad of 1258 is often considered one of the most violent sieges in history, and especially before sort of the modern era, is easily on the top of the highest casualty battles in history. The slaughter of the people of Baghdad is basically gone down in legend. They estimated to killed at least about 200,000 of city residents, and a lot of those are some of the Western or even Mongol sources, but I have heard from Persian sources that number be multiple times. I even saw a number that some Arab sources put it even maybe even closer to like 2 million. May not have been that much, but a very conservative estimate honestly is 200,000, which again, go ahead and look into highest casualty battles in history, and you're going to find this up there, which again is going to seem interesting because what a lot of the battles that have similar casualties you're going to find out in world history are much more modern. World War I, World War II, that kind of stuff. So it really is pretty legendary there. Well, anyways, they continued to push west through the Abbasid Empire until they came in contact with a couple groups that ended up helping to stop them. One of them is in Egypt. If you were following along before too. The Mamluks, who were originally a slave class that was in the military and ended up basically doing a military takeover of Egypt, which kicked the Abbasids out. They were able to withstand the Mongol push west into Egypt, and basically a coalition was a temporary coalition between the Mamluks and Christian Crusaders in Palestine ended up stopping the Mongol advance west there, as they both saw the Mongols both did as a serious threat to each other. Even again with this history of Christians and Muslims, this is like the end of the Crusades, and that hostility still between that saw the Mongols as like the biggest threat, which I think says a lot. Definitely says a lot about the threat the Mongols were. Okay, so this new sort of empire here is going to be called the Ilkhanate. Basically what it is, it's Persia. It's Persia. So it was in Central Asia, stretched west from Byzantium to east to the Oxus River, which is now called Amudarya. And Mongols ruled this kingdom. But the Mongols also understood something very beneficial, and that is how good Persians are at governing. Their administrative style that they had was excellent, and the Mongols knew that. So rather than just removing the entire administrative system that had made the Persians so useful, they basically kept it and oversaw it. So what they did is Persians, even though it's a Mongol-ruled kingdom, it was Persians that were actually serving as ministers or leaders as ministers, as well as provincial and local rulers. So they used that. In fact, the Mongols liked the Persian administrative so well that they actually brought them to rule over, like in China, which offended a lot of the Chinese because, first off, the Mongols did not trust the Chinese because of their constant history of warfare, but they thought the Persians were basically better. So, yeah. Anyway, one of the other big interesting things that happened was a lot of these Mongols that moved into Persia, most of them actually ended up converting to Islam. Remember, the Mongols are tolerant of religions, and Hulegu himself, the Khan himself, actually ended up converting to Islam. Now, what this definitely did was created a lot more unity. What ends up happening here is the Mongols also will intermarry with the locals, and basically they just blend over the next few generations, basically seamlessly into the Persian world at this time. Basically, they just blend and assimilate pretty much completely there. So now, once they really become much more Islamic in their viewpoints, you started to see a little. You definitely started to see some of the religious tolerance start to wane a bit here, and you started to see attacks on Jews and Christians, as now this has become a dominantly Islamic society once again, like it was before the Mongols showed up. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Ilkhanate. This is what you are talking about. So again, north of here would be Batu's the Golden Horde, the Empire of the Golden Horde, and this is the Ilkhanate. So you can see some of the sites here. Again, Baghdad was sacked. This ended up being a pretty domino effect type of thing too. By the way, when the city of Baghdad fell, if you had been following along with previous lessons, or there was what was called the Baghdad House of Wisdom, which housed some of the most learned, educated people in the entire world, really congregated in Baghdad. And on the eve basically of the Mongol conquest, those educated people dispersed. A bunch of them went into India, and that ends up spreading a whole bunch of really important academic achievements into India and mingling with those. A bunch of them went west. A lot of the Islamic ones went west as far as all the way going to Spain, to like Cordoba, which also was an intellectual center, and a lot of them moving to the northwest to what would be the Byzantine Empire. So basically the educated world dispersed, and in the end that actually ended up being a good thing from the educated point of view, because all of this ancient knowledge that had been really housed in Baghdad forever was starting to spread through the world, and you saw really little scientific explosions all over the place as a result of a brutal siege here, as people were running away from it. All right, and then the last one we're going to talk about of the Khanates, or these empires, is the Yuan, or what's going to be called the Yuan Dynasty. So this is a little bit different of a story. So Kublai Khan was one of the grandsons, of course, of Genghis, and he completed what his grandfather Genghis was never able to do, which is to completely conquer all of China. China, they had the Mongols had been fighting the Chinese for almost 100 years, to be honest, going back even before Chinggis Khan, but he eventually completed the conquest of China. Now, if you have kind of keep a track of your dynasties too, at this time, the Song Dynasty, which had ruled from about the 900s till now into the mid 1200s, they had been in charge of China, and that is who the Mongols were up against with their walled cities and incredible amounts of technology. The Song Dynasty was probably the most technologically advanced civilization probably on the planet at this time, arguably, but they were able to defeat them, and again, that's why it took decades and decades, and basically Kublai Khan spent basically all of his life conquering China. I mean, you can see the dates here, 1235 to 1271. Basically, his entire life was eventually conquering them. So he also, by the way, assumed the title of the Great Khan later on. After the death of Ogadai and kind of the progress that happened there, and with that title again, he kept fighting, and 11 years later, after this title, they officially defeated the Chinese. So they established what's called the Yuan Dynasty. So when you go through the dynasties of China and you learn through them, you're going to see them, and Yuan is going to be on a list. On that list. And if you look at that, if you don't know the history, you're going to look at that list and see Yuan Dynasty and not really make anything different of them. You're like, all right, there's another Chinese dynasty. This is a foreign dynasty. This is the Mongols. The Mongols create a dynasty that's going to last about 100 years in China. The city that they basically had destroyed, Zhengdu, they will rebuild that, and they called it actually then Dadu, which again, Beijing, I believe, later on. So the Yuan Dynasty ends up again conquering basically, or they end up controlling. This map basically combines what was China with the other Mongol conquests, so it's much more than, of course, China. But you'll see, and we'll talk in a minute about where they were stopped. They do not get Southeast Asia. They have a hard time conquering there, and tried multiple attempts to invade and conquer Japan, which I'll talk about more later. But anyways, this is going to be under rule here of the Mongols. So, like basically all of the Mongol dynasties, you have religious tolerance. Okay, Kublai Khan was definitely into that as well. He inspired previously oppressed people, Buddhists and Taoists, who actually under the Song Dynasty were oppressed that way. And then also tolerant of Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And with the opening or the reopening of the Silk Roads, you started to see a lot more of these people, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, making their way and actually establishing themselves in China at this time. And economically speaking, China made a fortune off of the Mongol years for the fact that they were importing or exporting as well as importing. Not something the Chinese really ever did much was a lot of importing, but they are going to do that because it's the Mongols are really facilitating this. And an interesting thing is this adds not only just to the experience of women in China at this time, but also in a lot of the world. Under Mongol kind of societal organization, women were actually far more independent than most women of other societies at the time. And you also, just as a larger, I think, lesson in there, usually what you find with more nomadic pastoralist peoples, you find women at a much higher standing than in agricultural societies, mostly because their job is so important as gatherers and herders and things like that, have a lot more importance that way than a lot of these other societies. So that's an interesting thing to make sure you know about Mongol women as compared to others. Now, when you put it all together, this is what you're looking at for the Mongol Empire, right? So you got the Empire or Khanate of the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate. Okay, you got the Yuan Dynasty. I didn't talk about this one as much, but you have what's called the Chagatai Khanate here, which is another group kind of in the central here, very much more Mongol, but not nearly as say, populated and diverse as, say, the Ilkhanate, the Golden Horde, or Yuan China. So you can see a few other things here. You got Karakoram, which is kind of the original capital for them. Samarkand, we talked about that as a very important trade city. There's Baghdad over here. There's Moscow. You are looking at something, of course, massive here. So let me show you now one more thing. Let's look at the growth of the Mongol Empire. Look at this animation. Now, when you look at this, you see this incredible spread. Okay, I'm going to let this run a few times here. But notice, this is not a very long time. So that's, okay, so the first blot, basically what you find, and we'll get to this, this is part of Genghis's initial, or the origins of the Mongols, so right here. And then he conquers this, and now he's conquering that. And then you start getting into this next couple blobs. That's the grandsons going in here. And this is all basically happening within the 13th century, as again, you see this spread going in pretty much all directions. Now, the last thing you saw there, the multicolored ones, here's basically what ends up happening. There is not going to be direct rule of one Khan administering over the entire empire. It basically breaks up almost immediately into these separate empires, and that's what the 5 you're going to see there. You got the Golden Horde up in the northwest, the Ilkhanate in the south west. You got the Chagatai Empire, or whatever you want to call them, in the center, and then the Yuan Dynasty. Sorry, there's 4. Those end up basically ruling themselves independently of each other. Okay. And what you are seeing here, and I'll go back to, just let this roll one more time. Back to the kind of full map here. This right here is the largest connected land and empire in human history. As far as territory goes, this is the largest empire in history. Okay, the only empire that can make a claim to this would be the British Empire. Okay, of the 1700s, but that's different because that was very spread out. It was not interconnected. It was through, the colonialism and stuff like that. But controlling more territory, yeah, the British might have. But as far as one connected empire, this is the largest empire in history, which is very much something notable. We'll show it one more time here. Look at this. And look at the years. It's not that many as you're going through there. In fact, most of that's within 1-2 generations. Incredible. From Genghis to his grandsons. I mean, it's 3 generations technically for all of this. That's incredible. Okay. All right. Let's talk about kind of how things start to end in a way. After Kublai Khan, you saw a lot of the tolerance and stuff, especially in China, start to end. And a lot of these Mongol rulers were starting to alienate a lot of the Chinese there. For example, because they didn't really trust the Chinese, they brought in hired foreign governors that would come over and administrate in China. Like I said, Persia, which really the Mongols really revered their political system and their administrative system. We're bringing those people into China. So they the Chinese really resented this Mongol occupation. They hated it. Basically, the entire time they hated it. One thing the Mongols did is they were not into the Confucianism, and they dismantled the civil service exam. That had to be kind of rebuilt after the Mongols. So yeah, they really, the scholar gentry class really kind of went away, as they were really powerful in the Song era. So Confucian scholars, basically useless at this time. And they even did some other things that further divided the Chinese and Mongol populations. For example, the Mongols did not want the Chinese speaking Mongolian. They said, no, you have to be Mongol. They did not want to, they encouraged, or just basically disallowed intermarriage between Mongols and Chinese. They told the Mongols, don't marry the Chinese. This is from the Mongol perspective. Don't intermarry with the Chinese. So you saw this very subjugated, racially divided society here. And this is just going to fuel more and more the resentment over the coming decades, that the Chinese are not going to like this occupation, and they're going to want to get rid of it. So what ends up happening too, as far as the limitation, especially in the east, was the Mongols tried to expand in more directions east. They tried to go to Japan. Kublai and the Mongols ended up putting together possibly one of the biggest navies ever assembled off the east coast of mainland Asia for conquest of Japan. And they made this massive invasion, naval invasion, right, an amphibious invasion of Japan. And due to some horrible luck, a typhoon came in and destroyed the Mongol fleet and ended it. right? So they were conquering there in southern Japan. Typhoon comes in and basically destroys their navy, and the surviving Mongols there had to retreat. So they go back, well, with Kublai or whatever, and now again, these ships, it's a large navy. It's not this like it's meant to transport people. It's not like the British Navy where they're going to go and just, it's not like the British, where they had these cannons and what the Portuguese were doing and blowing up those cities. They're just amassing this armada here for sure. And anyway, yeah, this was happening. So they actually returned back to mainland Asia and basically regroup for another years. And then they go on another amphibious invasion of Japan. And the crazy thing is the exact same thing happened again. Another basically typhoon hits, destroys them, nature basically destroying them. And you could believe the Japanese are like, wow, nature must be on our side. So that ends up being what kind of saves Japan in the end. They go down east into Southeast Asia, Vietnam and places like that. And this is actually a place where the Mongols struggled to fight in. The humid jungles of Southeast Asia were not good for what had been the superiority of the Mongol military. It was originally their horses. Their horses did not do well in this area, and a lot of the tactics and things did not work. It just was not environmentally feasible. Similar thing happened in India as well, so that's why the expansion southeast also stopped. Well, anyways, to continue on with that, here's what happens in China. Basically a secret society called the White Lotus Society was organized underground, and with the intent of throwing off the Yuan Dynasty starting in about the 1350s here. So they start kind of organizing and trying to grow this movement, this rebellious movement here. And then later on in the 1360s, under Zhu Yansheng, sorry for the pronunciation, so I messed that up, who was a Buddhist monk, actually a peasant Buddhist monk. And him and those followers ended up overthrowing the Yuan Dynasty officially in 1368, thus ending the about 100-year reign of the Yuan Dynasty in China. And this actually will bring the creation of the Ming Dynasty, one of the most famous and successful Chinese dynasties ever. We'll bring that. Ming, brilliant. And we'll talk about more about them in further units. But the goal basically for the Ming Dynasty was basically reverse everything the Mongols did. They just wanted to get rid of foreign influence, get China back to China again, and those sort of things. And that's the relationship the Chinese had with the Mongols will totally influence the China afterwards. And we'll leave that more to the future. But again, their experience was so bad under the Mongols that they're going to go to so many efforts to not let a foreign group have success or have a place like the Mongols did in China ever again. All right, well, that loss of power was very similar, that happened in China, is similar to what's going to happen in other places. Over time, we talked about the Golden Horde thing of what was going on there, Moscow, and specifically out of Moscow, the sort of rebellions and resistance against the Mongol was also happening there. So starting in 1368, the Golden Horde was losing its territory, and year after year we're regaining that, which will eventually bring this region back to Russian rule again and expand it, basically creating the modern Russia today. And then the Ilkhanate ends up being overrun by a conqueror named Tamerlane, who we'll talk about more in the future. There's a statue of him on the right side of the page there. So that is going to be what ends up ending the Ilkhanate. So you can see this kind of internal combustion, sort of, or not really combustion, but condensing of the empire, smaller and smaller, to basically these Mongol empires won't exist anymore. All right. Now, one of the really, really important things, maybe the most important thing we come out of this, is what is the long-term impact of the Mongol invasions? What is the influence? Why do we talk about them? And I can be honest, too. When AP World History was being reworked, originally they were going to go and use the time periods that basically what the universities generally do is split up history, kind of what's going to be modern and sort of early history at around mid-1400s, about 1500 CE, right? CE or AD, whatever. And really kind of marking kind of the the European Renaissance as kind of one of those turning points, but it's not really a real, when you look at it globally, that's not really the event that you can really say is like a tipping point or like a benchmark, as the world is going to be very different. The biggest reason why they ended up pushing the AP World Modern and curriculum back from the classical 1500 like point back to 1200 was mostly probably because of the Mongols. Because what they end up doing with the interconnectivity and the trans-regional connection here that happens really is what people, when you rewind things back, is in a way the beginning of the modern world. I mean, it may be overstating that, but that's really why this course, and why I think, as you're going to see more and more in history, this 1200 really the point of the Mongols, as being the point, I think, that is going to separate the modern, what people are going to consider modern and ancient. And that's what it seems like has happened here. But some of the evidences and things of that is, the big thing was revitalizing the trade routes, right? The Silk Road. The Silk Road was never as successful as it was under the Pax Mongolica years. It revitalized a broken trade, international trade system between Asia, the Middle East, Africa, for example. And some of the cultural exchanges, all the Islamic scientific knowledge ends up going to China, which incredibly benefits them. Chinese technology that was once under the Song Dynasty is now going to flood west. They, again, probably the most technologically advanced civilizations and the most industrious of all nations on the planet at that time. So like Chinese paper, for example, makes its way, and paper itself, and its uses is going to spread throughout the Middle East and all the way into Europe. This is what eventually is going to spur on the communication revolution in Europe with the Gutenberg printing press, which was the first kind of modern printing press. I mean, they had woodblock printing in China, but nothing as effective as this. So this is going to start that communication revolution, and the printing press is easily one of the most important inventions of all time. And again, the Mongols facilitating the use of paper out of China eventually into Europe is what ends up spurring this on. Remember, too, the Islamic world is what preserved Greek achievements. Okay, the philosophers, the scientific achievements were then preserved by the Islamic community, and once the Muslims took over, that then spread across the world as well. The Arabic numbering system is going to make its way into, in every direction, which is the numbering system that we use in the world today. Okay. Now, of course, when it comes to the Mongols, this interconnectivity, there's good things, and then there's terrible things. We cannot ignore the brutality and just the murderous pursuits of the Mongols, of course, but then also the indirect killing. For example, the Mongols are basically responsible for the plague. Okay, the worst pandemic disease, infiltration that has ever happened in history. Killing, like in places, over 50%, with a general of all plague affected regions across the world, which again went from East Asia to Central Asia to the Middle East to Northern Africa and Cairo and into the Europe. Probably around a quarter to a third of humanity probably dying from that. So the military conquests definitely transmitted the breeding grounds for the spread of the bubonic plague, right? Bubonic plague. The bubonic plague, at least especially early on, was transmitted by fleas. And fleas need a host, a biological host, and one of the most common ones for that was mice, which rapidly repopulate and move across trade routes because they find their way on ships, they find their way on all kinds of different cargo. And before you know it, the plague, which originated in more Eastern Asia, ends up getting facilitated through the conquest and through these trade routes. So conquest and through the Silk Road trade routes, all the way, of course, hitting the furthest west possible in Eurasia. So they're absolutely were the facilitators of the plague. Okay. Another success for them would be the successful rule a lot to centralizing of powers, trying to incorporate international laws for all conquered territories. Some other things too, this is where we're going to wrap up here today. A lot of fighting techniques of the Mongols. The Mongols basically brought an end to the success of walled cities, right? China and places in Europe had constantly survived throughout the Middle Ages on the protection that comes from walled cities, but because of their technological innovations of siege warfare, a lot of fighting ends up being obsolete. Walled cities will no longer be able to protect you anywhere in the world. The era of the knight in Europe will end as armored, protect the castle type warfare is now obsolete. And a lot of that came to some inventions. The Mongols, and with their interactions, a lot of people consider they're basically the ones that invented, or at least brought the necessity that ends up leading into the invention of the cannon. The cannon, more than anything, is what has ended ended walled city warfare and the biggest thing for siege warfare. So, because the Mongols basically what they ended up doing was combining, you got Chinese gunpowder, right, which came out of this time, and then innovating that with technology behind Muslim flamethrowers, and then European bell casting with the metals, adding it all together, and you get cannons. Now, of course, cannons are going to be innovated a lot more, and especially useful with later on, what the Mongols ends up influencing is what are called the gunpowder kingdoms, right? Islamic kingdoms like the Mongol Empire and the Ottoman Empire, for example, the Safavid Empire, who are going to invade and further develop the cannon into the large, big wheeled cannons that you usually think of. So, like, for example, one of the ones they innovated out in China were these, which helps, again, chip away at walled cities and stuff like that. So this is one of the ones that was influenced from the Song China that the Mongols ended up using, that looked like these kind of hand cannons here. But again, it just over time that eventually this will expand, and it brings a total end to and change in warfare in general. So there you go. All right, everybody. That then brings an end to our lesson today. I appreciate you being here. We're going to take a final look here at the chat and just go over any of the donations that came in during this time. All right, we'll start with the Streamlabs. I'm sorry, by the way, if donations did not end up popping up on the donation list. There seemed to be a glitch a little bit with the system of getting some of the donation names down below here in the orange box below, of getting those published. Sorry for that. I'll try to work on that for the future, but I'll definitely give these shout outs out here today. Through Streamlabs, we had a $5 donation from Taco 303rd Gaming. No question, didn't have a question or comment on there, but thank you very much for the donation. Really helps support this channel. Then over through the YouTube Super Chats. Sorry, some of those ended up not showing up, but I believe I can find those. I'm sorry, I do not want to ignore anybody. It seems to be a issue with the technology for the donations popping up, so I want to find that, make sure everyone gets their shout outs to know I really appreciate that. One second here. Okay, awesome. Got him now. Okay, so we had a $25 donation from Holy Omnissiah, who wants me to purchase that really cool kind of, if you've ever seen it, the Julius Caesar pencil holder, where it's like his statue, or at least like his bust of the top, and in the back there's a bunch of holes in it where you put your pencils. I will definitely use that. He specifically wanted me to get that and get it in my classroom or whatever, so that was awesome. Then we got a €20 donation from Claudio Arenas Leotard, and he's just said, big fan of history, keep it up. All right, thank you so much, Claudio, for donating and being so supportive of this stream. It really means a lot. All right, with that, I think that does for the donations. Again, I really appreciate everybody that joined here today. If this is your first time being around, then definitely I hope to have you subscribe to the channel. Enable notifications if you want to make sure you know when the live streams are. That's a great way to do that. A few other plugs just kind of on the way out. If you would like to influence the React videos and some of the React videos that come on this channel, great way to do that is to join the Patreon. Right now, patrons of all donation levels get to participate in a weekly poll for what videos end up going on there. But if you're here as a student, I wish you great luck in your studies. Keep studying. Never stop asking questions. Ask your teachers. Ask other people. Really take your education into your own hands, and I hope this has been useful for you. All right, with that, we are going to go ahead and call this a stream, and we hope to see you next time. Bye.